Thanks for staying with us right here on Sunrise as we continue this morning. Now, the rand was at its highest last night when President Jacob Zuma announced that he is resigning. It stood at 11 Rand 70 to the dollar. That's the highest it's been in 2.5 years. Now, the big question is, can we expect more positive reaction from the rand? And what will ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa have to work on in order to establish economic growth above 1%? And joining us in studio to discuss this, we're now joined by investment analyst Gilmour. Remember, you at home can be part of our conversation and contribute, of course, on 011-447-1742 or 447-1620. And we also have your comments on our Facebook and Twitter pages. Good morning, Chris, and thanks for joining us.
Morning, Penny.
I guess we start with that, the performance of the rand. It's been on a positive streak, I guess, as far back as the ANC conference when it was understood that Cyril will be voted into leadership.
Yes, that's right. Look, perhaps a little bit of historical context is required here. If you go back to December 2015, when Zuma fired Nhlanhla Nene,
Yes.
At that time, emerging market currencies generally were quite weak. And as a result, the rand fell, and it fell precipitously against the dollar particularly. And it was only through Pravin Gordhan taking over and laboriously working on the whole process that it kind of got back to some sort of reasonable level. And then, of course, in March of last year, when Pravin got fired, at that time, emerging market currencies were actually quite strong against the dollar was quite weak relatively. So it didn't fall as much, but it still fell throughout the course of the year. And as you say, as we came to the elective conference and it became clear that Cyril Ramaphosa was going to win the election and eventually become the new president, the rand strengthened significantly. So to answer your question, here we are with the rand having put on in a 2.5-year high. Is there much latitude for it to go significantly further? I would say probably not. Most of this has been discounted already. There's maybe a bit, and we'll see when the currency markets open properly this morning what degree of that is going to happen. And to your second point, what does Cyril Ramaphosa have to do? He really has an uphill task now. I went to a presentation by Colin Coleman of Goldman Sachs the other day. Wonderfully positive outlook, fantastically positive. But he made the point, you know, Cyril's task is now like, the analogy is unscrambling an egg. And I think, you know, foreign investors are sitting on the sidelines. They generally speaking, are very well disposed towards South Africa. I think a lot of money is probably waiting to come into the country. But what Cyril and his new cabinet has to now demonstrate unequivocally is that there is a new mindset, one that's an investor-friendly mindset, and I think he's done a huge job already on that front, at Davos particularly. So you put all that together, if you keep this positive momentum going, I think the rand could conceivably go a bit stronger. Two aspects coming up. The budget next week, an incredibly tough budget. You know, I really don't...
Why do you say that?
Well, here we are. We've got a 50 billion rand hole in the budget that you've got to try and close. And the information that's been seeping out suggests we're probably going to get a 2% rise in VAT. And that's going to be incredibly unpopular across the board. How they're going to tweak it, we don't know. It's not going to be a nice budget. It's going to be a consumer-unfriendly budget, to put it, if you can put it that way. But it's tough. And the ratings agencies particularly, and that's the second point, they're sitting on the sidelines looking at what's going on. I think Moody's particularly is very well disposed towards South Africa, always has been, and I think if they can possibly give us the benefit of the doubt, they will. But that's certainly not in the bag. And I would say as things currently stand, they're more likely to downgrade than not. However, if this positive momentum can be kept up, if it can be demonstrated there's an urgency that the mindset's changing, then we could possibly evade that.
What are the factors that speak to this positive outlook so we can be able to understand them and build on them?
I think the critical factor here is growth. You know, we've been stumbling along at less than 1% for the past couple of years now, and that's in nobody's interests. And that feeds into unemployment, and that's the greatest scourge that South Africa faces at this point in time. So if we can demonstrate that we have a plan to get growth going, and that's very, very difficult. It's less difficult than it was, ironically enough, even a few months ago, because the rest of the world is now moving, as they say, in a synchronized fashion. So if we can hitch our wagon, metaphorically speaking, to that global growth that's taking place, then it'll help to pull us out of this slough of despondency in which we currently find ourselves. So we have to do a number of things. And again, Colin Coleman touched on some of these a couple of days ago. you've got to get the youth back into work. And there
Yes.
are a number of initiatives that Cyril Ramaphosa, funnily enough, has been instrumental in trying to get off the ground. If you can do that, that again filters into more consumer spending, because people who were formerly unemployed and now brought back into the system are now spending. So that in itself helps. If we get money coming into the economy from outside and elsewhere, if you can persuade the private sector that there's a really good story to be told in South Africa, and there probably is, and it's getting better all the time, then that will help.
So for those who are saying that, are we really saying that, you know, Jacob Zuma's presidency or him at the helm was our biggest problem? But the ruling party is still the ruling party. Their policies on the economy still stands. Does it mean now that with Cyril Ramaphosa coming in, there will be a shift? What do we need to understand about that? Or what do you say to that?
Penny, I think you're spot on. That's exactly what's going to happen. You know, ever since democracy, we've had the ANC being a relatively neoliberal party. Yes, I know they've got kind of socialist backgrounds, but you know, they've adapted to the real politic of the real world. And I think we've kind of veered away from that under the Zuma administration. If we can demonstrate we're going back onto that kind of path, then I think that'll be taken incredibly positively. And again, I think Cyril is exactly the guy to do that type of thing.
Okay. What makes you say that? What is it about him that...
A number of things. You know, it's interesting. I mean, I'm old enough to remember in the mid-'80s when he used to lead marches down Pritchard Street to the old JSE there.
Yeah, well, he led the first grandstand of a march in the country.
Yes,
yeah.
I mean, he was a real firebrand. You know, so he has the credentials. So he's got the credentials on the union side, but he's also got it on the free market side, on the business side. Successful businessman in his own right. Known, he was part of the peace process in Northern Ireland. I think he was the honorary ambassador for Iceland. You know, he's been out there. People know of Cyril Ramaphosa. He's a world statesman, basically. And I found it really rather ironic for Zuma to say, well, I need to hold his hand and introduce him to other people in Africa, which is complete nonsense, of course.
Okay. So, but how can we be careful of not again putting all our confidence in one person instead of making sure that we have stable policies that will continue to sort of like encourage the outlook, the positive outlook that we're talking about?
Yeah. First thing is he's got to demonstrate that the cabinet is a proper cabinet full of competent people, and goodness knows there are plenty of competent people in the ANC and elsewhere. So he's spoilt for choice, and over the next few days I think he'll demonstrate that. So that's important. But we've also got to get, I think, implementation of the National Development Plan that Trevor Manuel and others put together so meticulously and laboriously. And again, that's a blueprint. It's far from perfect, we know that. But I think, again, it's giving you a kind of guide path that you can hitch your wagon to. So with that in mind, I think these relatively simple things that I'm describing, but in practice very difficult. If he can demonstrate that we are doing that, we have got a plan in mind and we're sticking to it, then I think that will be seen to be very, very positive indeed. Okay,
the big challenge, which you alluded to earlier on, is getting young people back into jobs, and we have a big challenge of unemployment that's currently sitting at like 26.7% or so. What are the things that you think could be done? I mean, we also have a challenge of free education not being budgeted for, amongst things like that, and the budget speech coming up early next week.
Yeah, I mean, you touch on an incredibly important point here, the free education side of things, and that's interlinked with our shocking lack of skills in South Africa. And look, the government has tried very hard over the years with things like ASGI SA and GIPSA to try and get skills moving. It hasn't worked anywhere near their satisfaction. So, you do need to get people into some sort of gainful employment. One of the hurdles here is things like the national minimum wage. And here's where I depart a bit
Which is coming
on the 1st of May.
Yes.
From a social perspective, I can understand precisely why people want it to come in. Unfortunately, I do see a danger inherently here, and that is in a country like South Africa, which is vulnerable in terms of technology coming and taking over many of those low-end jobs. I think there is a possibility you could see wide-scale job losses. So again, I was at a presentation by the Free Market Foundation a couple of weeks ago, where they were talking about remedies, where you can get certificates to allow people to kind of for want of a better expression, bypass the national minimum wage for a temporary period of time, just to get them back onto the
But the Labour will never
and
be
it's tough.
happy with that.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's so what should we look out for? Obviously, if he will get sworn in a day or so, the performance of the markets.
Already we've seen the markets, and I'm talking here more about what I'd call South Africa Inc. companies. In other words, companies that are dependent on the South African economy rather than the so-called rand hedges. With the rand being so strong, attention has come back onto the local market, and I think we're likely to see a continued improvement there. And the companies that spring to mind would be the banks, would be the retailers. I think there's a good possibility now, and again, a lot of this is dependent on what happens, A, in the budget, and B, with the ratings agencies. But I think a lot of people, the consensus now, is that we're going to see a progressive reduction in interest rates during the course of this year. Okay. Maybe as much as 75 basis points between now and the end of the year.
All right, we'll wait and see. Okay, got some comments on Facebook as I close off from some of our viewers, what their thoughts are. Well, they hope the price of eggs will go down. What if they're busy fixing those rates, Pella? Nothing really changes after Zuma exit. So the question was, the rand strengthened by nearly 2% from intraday highs last night. What do you make of the latest development? And then, so those are the things that people are hoping. What if, I think the rand will continue strengthening against the dollar since the head of corruption has fallen, and we'll see very soon the price of food and fuel dropping down. Likely?
I think so. Look, the Reserve Bank, Lesetja Kganyago, is looking for structurally lower inflation in South Africa. And I think he may well be right.